carriage stopped at the mouth of the St. Giles alley at 2 a.m, and Lottie Carberry, broadside seller and printer's widow, watched from her courtyard window as 2 men in shirt sleeves lifted a body out of the dark interior and dumped it face down on the cobbles. The gutter outside her press door was where the parish dumped its dead drunkards on hot nights. The body was a tall one. It did not move. The men did not look up. They climbed back into the carriage, the door snapped shut, and the wheels rolled away into Drury Lane with no sound but the hooves on wet stone. Lottie counted to 20. Then she counted to 20 again. After the second count, she put down her composing stick. She did not yet know that the man on the cobbles was the 4th Duke of Renfield, or that his first fiancée had paid for the drug in his cup, and the carriage and the dumping. She knew only that a body laid face down in a wet gutter could drown in 3 inches of rain if rain came. She went down the loft stair barefoot. The press door stuck the way it always did in August, and she forced it with her shoulder. Laudanum and gin came off him before she reached the gutter. She rolled him over with the side of her foot, the way she had learned to roll a man who might still have a knife. He was big and unarmed. His coat was torn, and someone had cut the buttons off the front of his shirt with a thin blade, careful enough to leave the skin under it whole. The thought of why his buttons had come off before he was dumped would have to wait. She fetched the printer's apron rope from inside the press door. She looped it under his arms. She walked backwards into her own doorway and dragged him in, his heels jolting on the threshold stone, the wet of the gutter coming off his coat in dark streaks across her hall flags. She kicked the door shut. She turned the key. She listened. The carriage did not come back. She let her breath out for the first time since the count of 20. By the press bench candle she saw he was breathing. Just. His pulse ran slow, but it ran. The laudanum on his breath was cut with gin, and under the gin something thin and metallic she could not name. She knew the smell of laudanum. Daniel had taken it the last winter of his lungs. She knew the smell of gin too. This was the parish. But the man on her hall floor was wearing boots that had cost the better part of £15. His coat cloth was the kind that was sold by the half-yard in the Burlington Arcade. She knew that too. She had hawked broadsides at the door of the arcade for 3 summers. A gentleman then. A gentleman dumped at the mouth of a St. Giles alley, with his buttons cut off and laudanum in his cup. After a moment, she got her hands under his shoulders and started up the loft stair. She was a small woman, but a printer's widow's forearms had set 10,000 sticks of type and rolled 10,000 sheets through the stanhope. She got him up the 8 risers a foot at a time, sliding more than lifting, and she laid him on the truckle bed beside the press where May slept, curled like a thumb in a folded fist. May did not wake. May rarely did. The fever she had taken at the age of 3 had left her half deaf and quiet, and the loft floor was the loft floor, and the press was the press, and a body on the truckle did not change the shape of the room she could feel through her cheek on the pillow. Lottie sat back on her heels and looked at the man in her candle. He was perhaps 28. The laudanum had not slackened the set of his mouth. His signet and his purse were gone, but a small visiting card case of plain silver had caught in the lining of his coat, where a hand searching for the wallet had missed it. The case stayed shut a moment longer. She dribbled water past his lips. She stripped off the wet coat and the boots and laid them by the hearth, and she covered him to the chin with a clean blanket. The pulse was still where she had left it. Then she sat in the press chair with the silver case in her hand and looked at it for a long while before she opened it. Inside there was a single card, plain, engraved in a single black script. Maximilian Vane. That was all. No address. No title. A man who carried a card with only his name on it carried it for one of 2 reasons. Either he was nobody and proud of it, or he was somebody and his name was enough. She closed the case. She set the press door bar in place, bolted the courtyard shutters, and laid the poker against the truckle within reach of her hand. Then she blew out the candle and lay down on her own pallet under the loft window. After a while, it began to rain. The kind that would have run an inch of water under her face turned to the cobbles. She did not sleep. The fever came up in him before dawn. She knew it would. Laudanum cut with what was not laudanum made a man sweat through a blanket inside a watch, and the gin in him would burn it through faster. She filled the kettle from the courtyard cistern at 4 a.m. and set it on the hearth hook and tore a strip from one of the older sheets and laid it across his forehead cool. He shifted under the cloth. He did not open his eyes. He said a word, faint and from far inside. He said, "Theodore." She did not know who Theodore was. She tucked the blanket tighter around his shoulder and laid her palm against his cheek to gauge the heat and did not say anything back. He said it again, and after the second time he did not say anything more for the rest of the night. She wrung out the cloth twice an hour until the grey came up against the courtyard window. May woke at 6. May saw the man on the truckle, looked at him long and without surprise the way she looked at most new things, and then turned her clear small face to Lottie and lifted her 2 hands in the small private signs they had built between them over the last 18 months. Her hands asked, "Who?" Lottie shook her head. Her hands asked, "Hurt." Lottie nodded. May nodded back. May went to the press stool, climbed up, took down the bread from the shelf above the type cases, and cut a slice for herself with the seriousness of a child who had cut her own bread since she was 5. She did not look at the man again, but she chose her stool so that her line of sight ran past the truckle to the loft window, and she put the bread down and ate it and watched the courtyard while Lottie wrung the cloth. May had been a witness all her life. The fever had made her one, and the silence she had grown up inside had sharpened it. She watched things other children did not bother to watch. She remembered them. That was the first thing she watched that morning. She watched the courtyard for the carriage. The carriage did not come back. May noted that, and finished her bread, and signed to Lottie that she would sweep the press floor as she did every morning, and went and got the broom. After a while, the fever in him broke and reset and broke again, and Lottie understood she would not be selling at the playhouse door that night, and that she would not be sleeping for a stretch she could not yet measure, and she sat down to it the way she had sat down to Daniel's last winter, which was to say, without sound and without argument and with the kettle on the hook. He came to on the second morning. He opened his eyes, and the eyes were grey and surprised and entirely sober, the laudanum gone out of him at last, and he looked at the beam and plaster ceiling 6 feet above his face, and at the small portrait of Margaret Carberry that hung on a nail above the loft hearth, and he did not move for a long minute. Then he turned his head and saw Lottie at the press bench. He said, "Where am I?" His voice was a gentleman's voice, schooled and a little hoarse and surprisingly polite. She said, "Above a print shop in Drury Lane. You were dropped in the alley at 2 on Sunday morning. This is Tuesday." He closed his eyes. He said, after a moment, "My name is John Vane. I beg your pardon for the trouble." She set down the typestick she was holding and walked across the loft and stood at the foot of the truckle bed and looked down at him. She said, "Your card case says Maximilian." He opened his eyes again and looked at her steadily and did not answer. She said, "I am not going to throw you out. I am going to ask you what was in the cup." He let his breath go. He said, "Laudanum, something else under it. I do not know what." She said, "Prussic, I should think, from the smell of you on Sunday." He looked at her with a small new attention. He said, "You know the smell of Prussic?" She said, "I have lived in this parish 10 years, and I have printed broadsides for the better part of 3. I know the smell of most things." He thought about that. He said, "John Vane is the name I will give the watch. Maximilian is the name on the card. I would be grateful if you would call me neither for the moment." She said, "What shall I call you then?" He said, "Vane will do." She nodded once. She said, "I am Lottie Carberry. The child on the stool is May Carberry, my late husband's daughter. She is half deaf, and you may speak in front of her as you please, because she will read your mouth before she hears your voice. I have bread, and I have small beer, and I have laid your coat at the hearth and burned the shirt because the front of it was cut to ribbons. You will eat what I bring you, and you will not get up before I tell you, and you will not put my child in the way of whatever it is you are running from. Is that clear?" He looked at her for a long time. He said, "Yes." She said, "Good," and went to the hearth. She did not believe John Vane. She had stopped believing him before he opened his mouth. The card case had been silver, and the cloth of the coat had been Bishop's blue superfine, and the boots had been Hobie boots not 3 months out of the maker's hand, and a man in those boots did not go by Vane to anybody who had eyes. She knew that. She knew it the way she knew the smell of Prussic. She brought him the bread and the small beer, and he ate slowly and a little, and after he had eaten he lay back and looked at the ceiling again, and said nothing for an hour. May worked at the press floor with her broom. May glanced at him twice. May did not glance at him for the third time, which was how Lottie knew her stepdaughter had decided about him for now. After the broom had been put away, May climbed onto the stool by the truckle and looked at the man on it and signed, slow, with her two small hands. Her hands asked, "What is your name?" He looked at her hands. He had clearly never seen the signs before. He looked at her face for the meaning of them, which was the right place to look, and he said, "Vain." May watched his mouth. May nodded politely. May signed to Lottie over her shoulder that the man on the bed was not telling the truth, and Lottie nodded back, and that was the household agreement on the matter for the second day. On the third morning she went to the press and set a half column. She set it without thinking, the way her hands set most of what she set. The column was a parish notice she had been paid for the week before and had not yet run. She ran it off in 50 sheets and folded them and tied them in a bundle for the parish clerk and put the bundle by the door. Then she stood for a moment looking at the press. She had a press. She had a press, and a man in her loft with no name and no signet, and a face full of fever, and the smell of prussic, on a coat she had burned at the hearth. She did not move toward the press yet. The thought of what a press could do was a thought she set aside the way she had set aside the type-stick when he opened his eyes. She would come back to it. May fell ill on the fourth night. It came on quick, the way it had come on quick when she was 3. Lottie put her hand on the child's forehead at the after-supper hour and felt the heat there, and went still inside the way only mothers of one child go still. The man on the truckle saw the going still from across the loft, and pushed himself up on one elbow against the wall. He said, "What is it?" She said, "The child has a fever." He said, "Bring her here." She looked at him. He was 4 days into recovery from a poisoned cup. He had pushed himself up on the elbow, and his face had gone the colour of cheap paper with the effort. He said, "I will not give it to her. Whatever I had was in my cup, not in my breath. Bring her here and lay her by me. The truckle is warm, and your own pallet is on the floor, and she will be warmer on the bed." He was right about the truckle. She did not have time to argue. She gathered May up in the blanket and laid her down at the wall side of the truckle, the man on the outside between the child and the loft, and she went down to the hearth to set water for the willow bark tea. When she came back up, he had turned his body to make a windbreak for the child between his back and the wall, and he had laid his palm on the back of her head and held it there steady, and he had spoken to her low and slow with his lips at her ear, so that the sound of him and the shape of his mouth on her cheek would tell her she was not alone in the heat. May had her eyes shut. May did not seem to mind being touched by a man she did not know. May trusted Lottie's nod, and Lottie had nodded. Lottie put the cup of tea to May's lips and held it there and got most of it into her, and then she sat down on the press stool and watched. The vigil went all night. The man on the bed did not lie back down. He kept the child between his arm and his side, and he kept his palm on the back of her head, and when the fever came up sharp at 4, he turned and held her against his chest, while Lottie wrung the cloth at the basin. He did not speak much. He spoke to May when she shifted, low words about nothing, about a horse he had once had, about a winter in St. Petersburg when the river had frozen so hard it had gone black, about a stone bench in a garden where a younger brother had once stood and made him laugh until he had cried. Most of it May did not hear. Some of it she read off his mouth when she opened her eyes. Lottie heard it. Lottie heard the brother in particular. At the grey hour, with the fever beginning at last to break and the child asleep against his ribs, he looked across the candle at Lottie and said quietly, "I had a brother. He died 4 years ago. Theodore. I've not said his name aloud in any room I sleep in since the month it happened." She set down the cloth. She said, "Was Theodore older?" He said, "Yes," she said, "and the dukedom came to you." He looked at her, in the candle, with the child sleeping in the bend of his arm. He had not said the word dukedom in the loft. She had not said the word dukedom. She had not said John Vane, and she had not said Maximilian. He said, "Yes." She nodded. She said, "I was the second wife. Daniel was my husband. He had a first wife called Margaret. Margaret died with this child 8 years ago. Daniel loved Margaret until the day he died. He was kind to me. He was honest. He did not love me. I have been a wife after a wife, the way you have been a brother after a brother. He looked at her for a long time. He said, after. She said, after. The word sat between them on the truckle bed, with the sleeping child between them, and the candle burned down a quarter-inch before either of them said anything else. He said, I am the 4th Duke of Renfield. My brother Theodore was the 3rd. He died in the snow at our country house in 1824. The verdict was a fall from a horse and an accidental discharge of his own shooting party. My mother told me in the chapel that night that the woman I had become engaged to a month before had been my brother's mistress for 2 years. I broke the engagement before the next morning. I went to St. Petersburg for 4 years. I came home in May. I am to be married in 8 days to a kind woman called Lady Sophronia Quincy, who does not love me and whom I do not love. On Sunday night I was lured to a gaming hell in Coventry Street and drugged in my cup, and I do not yet know who paid for it. That is the whole of what I know. The candle burned down another quarter-inch. Lottie said, And the woman who was your brother's mistress? What was her name? He said, Annabel Tarrick. She nodded. She said, I will set a broadside. He did not understand her at first. She said, Tomorrow morning, a penny a sheet. I will put a question on it. I will ask if anyone in the parish saw a closed carriage at the mouth of the St. Giles alley between 2 and 3 on Sunday morning. I will sell it through the playhouse crowds for 3 nights. I have done it before for a missing apprentice and for a girl whose mother wanted her named. I have a network of paper boys and link boys at every playhouse door in the city. If a man saw your carriage, I will hear of it by Friday. After that we will know whether to call the watch or the magistrate. He stared at her. He said, You are not afraid of who might have hired the carriage. She said, I am afraid. I have a child in this loft and a press on the floor and a roof I cannot lose. I am very afraid. But there is no clean way to do this that is not the broadside. The watch will not stir for a duke they cannot see, and the magistrate will not stir for a duke who is hiding in a print loft. I print my way through this. Or you walk out of my door tomorrow and try the streets alone and you do not last a week. He looked at her steadily. He said, Then I owe you what I cannot pay. She said, You can pay me by living. I will set the type in the morning. She set it before dawn. She set it standing up at the case with the candle at her shoulder. She set the title in 12-point bold across the top of the sheet. A duke is missing. Who saw the carriage at St. Giles? And she set the body of it in 8-point, with 2 paragraphs of plain question, asking for any soul who had been in the courtyard of the Drury Lane print shop, or on the Tothill Street round, or near the Coventry Street curb, between midnight and 3 on the 17th of August, to send word to the small press above the late Daniel Carberry's shop in the alley, where there was bread and a penny for any sworn account. She ran off 200 copies on the Stanhope by 7 in the morning. She put them in the bundle bag and put the bag on her shoulder and went down to the playhouse doors at the opening of the matinee, and she sold them at a penny apiece, and she sold most of them, and she came home at 4 in the afternoon with 8 shillings in her apron and the bag light on her shoulder. The first answer came that night. It came in the shape of a small boy of 13, with a link iron on a leather strap and a face washed for the occasion. He stood at the press door and asked for the printer, Mrs. Carberry, and when Lottie came down he handed her a folded sheet of her own broadside and pointed at the question on it. He said, I saw it. I was holding a link at the Drury Lane stage door corner. The carriage came at 2:15. 2 men, coatless. They lifted a man out the offside door and put him down in the alley, and the carriage drove off toward the Strand. The offside wheel rim had a stripe of Tarrick green on it, which I know because my master's brother is a wheelwright, and Tarrick livery comes through his yard. Lottie said, Your name? He said, Sammy Brent. She said, Will you swear that before a magistrate, Sammy Brent? He said, Yes, ma'am. She gave him 6pence and a piece of buttered bread and told him to come back on Monday after sunset, and she watched him go out of the courtyard at a run with the bread in his fist and the 6pence in his pocket, and she went back up the loft stair and laid the folded sheet on the truckle blanket and said only, 1. The man on the truckle, who was now sitting up against the bolster and looking less the colour of cheap paper, said, What is the wheel rim stripe? She said, Tarrick livery. He shut his eyes. He said after a long pause, She paid for the carriage. She said, Yes. He opened his eyes again. He said, Then she paid for Theodore. She nodded. He said, I would like to send for the surgeon who certified my brother's death in 1824. He was a country man, an honest one, and his footnote on the report was a refusal to certify the verdict the coroner brought in. The report is in the Renfield Mayfair Library safe. I would like to ask my own solicitor to bring it out quietly, by his own hand, and to send for the surgeon out of Greenwich. The solicitor will come at once. The surgeon will take a day. She said, Can your solicitor be trusted not to send word to your mother? He looked at her. He said, He has been my solicitor, and Theodore's before me. He will keep his mouth shut if I write the letter in my own hand. She brought him paper, and the inkstand and a pen, and he wrote the letter at the truckle on a board she laid across his knees, and she sealed it with a candle, and walked it across to Lincoln's Inn herself in the early evening, and put it in the hand of the porter at the chamber's door. And she came home to the loft and went up the stair and found May asleep on the pallet under the window, and the Duke sitting up against the bolster on the truckle reading a sheet of broadside type with his finger moving across the 8-point line. He looked up when she came in. He said, You printed a broadside? She said, Yes. He said, Thank you. The second answer came on the Friday. It came in the shape of the Tothill Street parish watchman, a man of 44 named Jasper Bray, who had been at his round on the night of the 17th, and who had taken note of a closed carriage with a partially cloaked crest at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning. He had written it in his parish nightbook. He had written it because the wheel rims had been Tarrick livery, and because he had been a Tarrick groom in his younger years before the baronet had let his stables go for debt, and because the sight of his old livery on a closed carriage at the mouth of a St. Giles alley on a wet Sunday morning had struck him as a thing worth recording. He had recorded the make, the wheel, the 2 coatless men on the rumble seat, and the long object lowered into the alley. He brought the nightbook to the print loft door. He laid it on the press bench. He said, I do not know what is going on in your loft, Mrs. Carberry. I do not need to know. I have brought my book, and I will swear my book before any magistrate you put me in front of. I will not lift it for any man under the title of Baronet Tarrick, and I will not lift it for the lady his daughter, and that is my whole speech. Lottie wrote his name and his round and the entry time in her own ledger, and gave him 5 shillings out of the morning's takings, and the watchman went back to his round. She brought the nightbook up to the loft. The Duke read it at the truckle in the late light. He said, 2. The third answer came on the Saturday. It came in the shape of a discharged housekeeper of the Masquerade Gaming Hell in Coventry Street, an Eliza Wick of 51, who had been let go a year ago after the new owner had come in, and who lived in a 1-room lodging in 7 Dials, with 7 grandchildren and a great-aunt. She had read the broadside at the King's Theatre door on Friday night, where her eldest grandson sold oranges, and she had walked across to Drury Lane on the Saturday morning, and she had stood at the press door and asked Lottie outright whether the dropped man on the broadside might have been a tall, fair gentleman dropped off out of the Masquerade back passage at the curb of Coventry Street between 1:30 and 2 on Sunday morning. Lottie said, Come up. Mrs. Wick came up. Mrs. Wick stood in the loft and looked at the man on the truckle, and she put her hand to her mouth and said, Lord have mercy upon us. It was the Duke. The Duke said, Mrs. Wick. Mrs. Wick said, Your Grace. She sat down on the press stool without being asked and folded her hands in her lap and looked from the Duke to Lottie and back. She said, I was not in the house any longer, you understand. I was dismissed a 12-month ago. But the morning of Saturday the 16th I was sent for. The lady came in a hired chair to the 7 Dials lodging, and she paid me £40 in Tarrick notes marked, and she asked me to open the side room at the Masquerade on Sunday at midnight, and to put a particular drug in the cup of the gentleman my replacement would point out to me, and to have the carriage at the back door for 1:30. I knew the drug. I knew it was a killing drug if it was given in the dose she asked for. I'd been 10 years in that house and a year out of it, and I had 7 grandchildren to feed. I took the money. I did the work. I have not slept on the matter since the Sunday, Your Grace, and I have come because the broadside seller has asked the question, and I would rather sit in front of the magistrate than in front of my own door at 3 in the morning. She took the marked Tarrick notes out of the breast of her gown. She laid them on the press bench beside the watchman's nightbook. The Duke looked at the notes. The Duke said, 3. Lottie wrote out Mrs. Wick's statement in her own hand at the press bench, and Mrs. Wick made her mark at the foot of it, and the parish constable, who was Mr. Bray's brother-in-law and had been sent for at noon, signed it as witness. The constable looked at the press bench, at the night book, at the mark notes, at the statement, at the Duke on the truckle, and at Lottie, and he said only, "Mrs. Carberry, this is a Bow Street matter." And Lottie said, "I know that, Mr. Bray. I'm setting the chain first. I will not take it to Bow Street until the chain is whole." The constable nodded once and went away. The fourth answer came on the Monday. It came in the shape of a letter, not a witness. It came from the Duke's own solicitor, who had spent the previous 3 days in the Renfield Mayfair Library with the safe open and the 1824 surgeon's confidential report in his hand. The letter was short and the report was enclosed. The surgeon, a Mr. Hadwin, now retired to Greenwich, had refused to certify the coroner's verdict at the time because the powder burn on Theodore Vane's shoulder and the angle of the ball through his chest were consistent with a hand pistol fired at no more than 10 feet and not a hunting rifle from horseback at 40 yards. He had written it in his own hand at the foot of the report. He had submitted the report to the family. He had heard nothing back, and the coroner's verdict had stood. Mr. Hadwin was now 81 and had not been called to give evidence on the matter in his life. The solicitor had written to him at Greenwich the same morning. Mr. Hadwin had answered by the next post that he would come to Bow Street on any day Mr. Hadwin was wanted and would speak whatever he was asked. The Duke read the letter and the surgeon's footnote and lay back on the truckle bolster and shut his eyes for a long time. When he opened them, he said, "I held him in my arms in the snow. I did not look at the wound. He spoke my name twice. He said, 'Ask Annabel.' I thought he meant, 'Ask Annabel to come.' I thought he meant, 'Ask Annabel to forgive him for the engagement he had been going to break that morning.' I did not look at the wound, and I did not ask Annabel anything, and the next time I saw her was at the funeral, and the next time after that was the morning I went to the chapel and broke the engagement she had made with me." He looked at the loft ceiling. He said, "I should have looked at the wound." Lottie did not answer that. She had nothing to say to it that was not the wrong thing. After a moment he said, "4. There will need to be one more. The man who fired the pistol, or the man who slipped the saddle strap. One of them is still alive. They were both in our pay until I came home in May. The strapman, Pry, is still in the Renfield stables in Berkshire. The gunman, Crail, was discharged in 1825 for drink. He went to a Bermondsey rookery, the steward said, and I have not heard of him since." Lottie said, "I will send a paper boy to Bermondsey." She sent 2. She paid them 6pence each and bread for a week and the promise of a shilling apiece on a true find. They came back on the Wednesday with the name of a public house and the name of the back room in which a man named Hollis Crail was drinking himself to death at the rate of a pint of gin a day on the kindness of a landlord who had once been a Renfield underkeeper. She did not send for the constable yet. She sent the Duke's solicitor instead. The solicitor went to Bermondsey with a clerk and 2 guineas, and he came back with Hollis Crail in a hired hackney, washed, sober for the first time in a fortnight, and carrying under his coat a sealed packet that had been buried under the floorboards of his Bermondsey lodging for 4 years and 7 months. The packet contained a letter in a clean copperplate hand, dated the 8th of December 1823, signed Annabel Tarrick, addressed to Mr. Hollis Crail of the Renfield estate, instructing the recipient to fire upon the body of Theodore Vane at the road during the morning's beat line on the day after Christmas, and offering 20 guineas on completion to be paid in mark notes through a private chair to the Bermondsey address. The Duke read the letter in the print loft on the Wednesday night. He laid it on the truckle blanket. He said, 5. After he had said it, he put his face in his hands. Lottie sat down on the press stool beside the truckle and looked away while he put his face in his hands. May was at the loft window stool with the broom across her knees and her eyes on the courtyard. May had been at the window every night since the broadside had started selling. May was not asleep. May had not been properly asleep for a week. The household understood what May was doing, and nobody asked her to stop. After a long while, the Duke let his hands fall. He said, "Pry will give his deposition the moment Crail's is on the table. They have been afraid of each other for 4 years. They will turn on each other inside an hour." Lottie said, "I will send the solicitor to Berkshire in the morning." He said, "Yes," and Lottie. She looked at him. She said, "Yes." He said, "She will come for you the moment she knows. She has known I am alive in this loft since Mrs. Wick crossed Coventry Street on Saturday morning. She will not have moved yet because she will not believe that the broadside has reached as far as it has. By tomorrow she will move. She will send men to this courtyard, and she will come herself within the week. She said, I know. He said, I will not have her in this loft with May in it. She said, neither will I. He said, then we will need to take the chain to Bow Street before Friday. She said, Friday morning. I will set the broadside on the day. He said, and one other thing. She waited. He said, I am going tomorrow morning to Lady Sophronia Quincy. I am going to tell her the whole of it, in her father's drawing room, in the daylight. I owe her that, and the settlement she signed in good faith I will not break in any other way. She is a kind woman and an honest one, and she will not stand in our road. But I owe her the truth from my own mouth before any of this is on a magistrate's table. She said, yes. He looked at her for a moment. He said, I will come back. She said, I know that too. She did not entirely know it. She knew it the way a printer's widow knew most things, by the weight of the thing in her hand. He was a duke. He had been almost killed. He had a fiancée he did not love, and another fiancée he did love who had paid to have his brother shot in the snow. He had 4 years of frozen silence behind him, and a settlement deed in a Mayfair lawyer's safe. He was going home in the morning to a Mayfair square in his own clothes, and he was going on from the square to a kind woman's drawing room, and he was going on from the drawing room to a magistrate's office. He would be in his own world for the first time in 9 days. He would remember what his own world weighed. She was a printer's widow with a half-deaf stepchild and a Stanhope press, and she had set a broadside and dragged a man out of an alley, and she had been useful, the way a hedge was useful to a fox in winter. She did not blame him for what she expected him to remember. She helped him into the better of the 2 coats she had cleaned for him, and she gave him the spare key to the press door so he could let himself in at the back at any hour. And she walked him to the courtyard gate before dawn on the Thursday morning, and she watched him cross the gate arch into the alley and turn the corner toward the Strand, and she went back upstairs. May was at the loft window when she came up. May signed, slow and steady, did he say after. Lottie sat down on the press stool and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She said aloud. He said, after one time. I said after once. Then we did not say it any more. She had said after to him 5 days ago on a truckle bed, with his fevered child between them. She had said after about Daniel and Margaret. He had said it about Theodore. After was the word she had lived inside since the year Daniel had married her. After was the word she would go on living inside, in the loft above the press, with May and the broom and the inkstone and the playhouse door round on a Saturday night. She had known that on the Sunday morning when she had dragged him in by the apron rope. She had known it about him from the silver case in the lining of his coat. She had known the man on the truckle bed was someone she would care for and watch leave, the way she had watched her husband die, and the way she had watched her stepchild grow taller than her own waist without once being called Mama. She did not blame the world for the shape of it. She had a press. She had a child. She had 8 shillings in the apron and the half of a broadside still tied in a bundle by the press door. Whatever came after, came after. She would print her way through it. She set the column for Friday at 6 in the morning. She set the title in 14-point black, larger than the first broadside, 3 lines, The Duke of Renfield is alive. He was drugged in his cup at the masquerade. The name of the hand that paid for it is before the magistrate. Underneath that she set the body of it in 8-point. The alley, the carriage, the 4 witnesses, the surgeon's footnote, the housekeeper, the gamekeeper, the broadside cellar of Drury Lane. She did not run it off yet. She locked the chase and laid it on the bench under a clean cloth, and she waited. The Duke did not come back on the Thursday. By evening there was still no word. At 11 at night 2 men came into the courtyard. May saw them first from the loft window. May was on the stool with the broom across her knees, and she had been watching the courtyard for 9 nights, and she did not need to look twice. She came down the loft on her bare small feet without a sound, and she crossed to where Lottie was setting tea at the hearth, and she put both hands on Lottie's apron and signed, 2 men, courtyard, gate. Lottie did not waste a breath. She crossed to the loft window and looked. 2 men in dark coats at the gate arch in shadow, looking up at the loft light. She turned, and she pinched out the candle on the table, and she carried May to the empty paper store under the press bed, and lifted her in and laid her down on the folded broadsides at the bottom of it, and pressed a finger to her own mouth, which May did not need to be told, and she pulled the curtain across the paper store and let it fall. Then she went down the loft stair in the dark and stood inside the press door. The two men did not knock. They tried the press door first. They tried it twice. They went around to the courtyard cistern and tried the back shutter. They tried the gate arch alley once. They stood in the courtyard a long while. Then one of them said something to the other in a low voice, and they went. Lottie stayed inside the press door for a count of 200. She did not breathe loud. She did not move. After the count, she went up the loft stair on her bare feet and lifted May out of the paper store and held her on her hip for the first time in a year, the child too big now to be carried but small enough still, and she sat down on the truckle bed and held her and did not put her down for a long time. May signed after a while against Lottie's neck where Lottie said, "He has not come back yet." May signed, "Will he?" Lottie said, "I do not know." May did not sign anything else. May went to sleep against Lottie's neck instead, and Lottie laid her on the truckle and covered her with the Duke's blanket, because it was the warmest blanket in the loft, and she sat down on the press stool and did not sleep. He came back at 3:30 in the morning. He came in by the press door with the spare key. There was a cut on his cheek. He climbed the loft stair without a sound, stood at the top, and looked at her, and at May on the truckle in his blanket. He said only, "Two men. They were watching the Mayfair house. I came around through the mews and into the Strand and along the back of Drury Lane on foot. Lady Sophronia has released me. The settlement is being unsigned by her father's hand at this hour. The release is being written tonight and will be in the post in the morning. The magistrate has the surgeon and Crail and Mrs. Wick at his lodging. The hearing is set for tomorrow noon." He stopped. He said, "There were two men here as well." She said, "Half an hour ago." He looked at the truckle. He said, "She knows." She said, "She has known since Saturday." He said, "Then she will be at Bow Street tomorrow noon as well, in her best mourning dove silk, to attend the sympathy hearing she expects for the drowned drunkard. She does not yet know that the hearing is for her." He came across the loft floor and sat down on the press stool opposite Lottie. He looked at her in the candle that was no longer burning, only the hearth glow on his face. He did not touch her. He had not touched her in all the 9 days she had been pulling cloths off his forehead and ladling tea past his lips and writing his letters. He had been a duke in a printer's loft, and he had been polite, and he had not touched her. He did not touch her now. He said, "Lottie, I have 8 hours, and I have to ask you a thing. I'm asking it in the wrong way, and in the wrong room, and on the wrong night, and I am asking it anyway, because I have nothing else." She waited. He said, "Marry me," before the hearing. The chaplain at Bow Street is Mr. Yelverton. He keeps a special license in his desk for the magistrate's side room. He will marry us at dawn, in the side room, with a constable and a clerk as witnesses. I am asking it, because as Duchess of Renfield your testimony will not be picked apart on the grounds of trade and class, and Annabel's solicitor cannot reach you on the customary objection. I am asking it because May will go on the parish register tomorrow as Mary Carberry Vane, and the Renfield style will cover her, and Annabel cannot reach her either. I am asking it for protection. I am asking it because by noon tomorrow, the woman in mourning dove silk, who has been waiting at the masquerade door for 9 days for word that I am dead, will know I am alive, and she will not be at liberty for long, but she is at liberty tonight, and I will not leave you and May on this side of the morning unsheltered." He stopped. He said, "I am not asking it for love. I am asking it because I do not have a better word for it tonight, and I have 8 hours. I am asking it as the only thing I have that is mine to give. Will you say yes?" She looked at him. She looked at him for a long while. The hearth glowed across his cut cheek and across the torn cuff and across the slate of his eyes, and the loft was very quiet, and May was breathing slow under his blanket, and the press stood in the dark at the back wall with the locked chase on the bench under the cloth. She had thought she would have to come at it sideways. She had thought she would have to read his returning as a man returning to his world and forgetting the loft. She had thought she would have to retreat from him on the press stool the way she had retreated from Daniel after the wedding, when she had understood that Margaret would never leave the loft hearth. She had set herself in the long week for the small clean cut of being left behind. He had not come back to leave her behind. He had come back with a cut on his cheek and a release of settlement in the post, and a chaplain to marry them in a side room and a paper trail laid out on the magistrate's table. He had come back because there were two men in the courtyard, and he had been afraid she would be in the loft alone when they came back. He had not used the word love. He had used the word protection. She had spent a marriage being loved second. She knew what being loved second cost. She did not need the word love from him tonight. She needed the cut cheek and the side room and the chaplain. She needed the press door bolted and May on the parish register in his name by sundown. She needed the broadside in the Chase to come down off the press at noon with its 3 black lines reading. She would take what he was offering. She would take it for May. She would take it because the silver card case in the lining of his coat had said Maximilian Vane, and she had not put the case down for an hour that night, and because he had laid his palm on the back of May's head at 4 a.m. and held it there steady, and because the word after had sat on the truckle between them, and he had not flinched from it. She said, yes. He let his breath go. He said, thank you. She said, cover your cheek. I will boil water. May will need a clean dress for the side room. I will set the broadside on the press at 6. We will go to Bow Street at 7. Mr. Yelverton at past. Sir Richard Burney at noon. He said, yes. She said, and the word you said in the snow you should have asked your brother. Ask Annabel. We will ask her at noon, in front of the chief magistrate, in front of the surgeon, in front of Mrs. Wick. We will not let her say no. He looked at her. He said, no. She nodded. She went to the hearth and she filled the kettle and she set it on the hook, and she did not look at him again until the water boiled. They were married in the side room at the Bow Street public office at 6:22 on the morning of the 4th of September 1828. Mr. Yelverton officiated. The constable and a clerk witnessed. May Carberry stood at Lottie's left hand in the clean dress, and held the Duke's left thumb in her own small hand, and looked at the chaplain's mouth and read the words off his lips. Mrs. Eliza Wick, who had come up to Bow Street the night before and slept at the magistrate's housekeeper's hearth, stood at the door and wept quietly into a clean handkerchief. The Duke wore his own dark coat and his own dark cravat, and the signet of his late brother on the little finger of his left hand, because his own ducal signet was still in the magistrate's evidence drawer where Mrs. Wick had laid it on the Saturday. The chaplain read the words, the chaplain pronounced them, the chaplain signed the register, the constable signed, the clerk signed. May Carberry made her own careful mark beside her stepmother's name, the way Lottie had taught her at the press stool, slow and round. Then they walked through the inner door into the courtroom proper. The courtroom was packed. Lottie's broadside had been running in the streets since the dawn run on the press at 6. 1,400 copies, sold at 3 pennies a sheet to a city that had been reading her first broadside for a week, and half of London had come at Bow Street to see if the second was true. It was true. The Duke walked into the front bench alive in his own clothes, with the signet of his dead brother on his left hand, and the printer's widow in a clean wool gown at his right, and the half-deaf child between them. Sir Richard Burney looked up from his bench and looked at the Duke and looked at Lottie, and his face did not change, but Lottie saw the small flicker at the corner of his mouth that was the Chief Magistrate of London, understanding that the morning's hearing was not the one he had been told it was. Mr. Hadwin the surgeon was at the side. Jasper Bray was at the side with a nightbook. Sammy Brent was on the bench beside his link-master, in his cleanest shirt. Hollis Crail and Walter Pry were under guard at the back, both white and both sober. Mrs. Wick was at the witness box, ready. The Duke's solicitor had laid out the chain on the magistrate's table in the order it would be read, and Miss Annabel Tarrick was in the front gallery in mourning dove silk, with a black ribbon at her throat and a black-edged handkerchief in her hand, and a small composed face turned toward the magistrate's bench in the expectation of a sympathy hearing in honour of a drowned drunkard. She did not see Lottie at first. She did not look at the front bench. She was looking at Sir Richard Burney. Mr. Burney opened the hearing. He named the matter as the apparent unlawful drugging and abduction of Maximilian Vane, 4th Duke of Renfield, on the night of the 17th of August, and the connected matter of the death of Theodore Vane, 3rd Duke of Renfield, on the 26th of December 1824, the second matter having been opened to the bench by sworn statement that morning. The gallery went quiet at the second matter. Annabel Tarrick's small composed face shifted by a single muscle and held still. The chain went up. Mrs. Wick took the box first. Mrs. Wick gave her name and her age, and her year of dismissal from the masquerade, and her statement of the morning of the 16th of August in detail. She produced the marked Tarrick notes from her reticule and laid them on the magistrate's table. She named the lady who had paid her. She named her by full name and title. Annabel Tarrick rose in the gallery. Mr. Burney said quietly, "Miss Tarrick will keep her seat or be removed." Miss Tarrick sat. Jasper Bray took the box. Jasper Bray gave his name, his round, his nightbook entry, the wheel-rim livery, the time, the carriage, the two coatless men, the long object lowered into the alley. He produced the nightbook. The clerk read the entry. Sammy Brent took the box. Sammy Brent said his name, his master's name, his position at the Drury Lane stage door corner, the carriage at 2:15, the two men, the man dropped in the alley, the Tarrick green stripe on the wheel rim. Hollis Crail was brought in. Hollis Crail had spent the night sober and had been sober for a week, and the bones of his face were not the bones of a man who would live another year, but the voice was clear. He named himself. He named his late position as Renfield underkeeper. He named the morning of the 26th of December 1824, and the road, and the beat line, and the close range, and the hand pistol he had been paid 20 guineas to fire at his master's elder brother. He produced from his coat the letter in Annabel Tarrick's hand. The clerk read it aloud. The court was silent through the reading. Walter Pry was brought in. Walter Pry was a man of 53 who had been a coward in the Renfield stable-yard for 4 years, and who had been promised by the Duke's own solicitor the night before that he would not hang. He named himself, his position, the saddle strap, the cut of it, on the night of the 25th, the 10 guineas. He produced from the lining of his old groom's coat a second letter in Annabel Tarrick's hand. The clerk read it aloud. Mr. Hadwin, the surgeon, 81, was helped to the box by his clerk. Mr. Hadwin spoke for 9 minutes about the powder burn on Theodore Vane's shoulder and the angle of the ball through his chest. Mr. Hadwin laid the 1824 report on the table. Mr. Hadwin signed his footnote in fresh ink at the foot of it in front of the bench, the way an honest man signs a thing he has been waiting 4 years to sign. Then the Duke was called. Maximilian Vane gave his name and his title, and the night of the 17th of August in his own quiet voice. He named the masquerade, he named the cup, he named the carriage, he named the alley behind the Drury Lane print shop. He named the press loft above the late Daniel Carberry's shop. He named the broadside seller who had dragged him in by the apron rope, and who had laid him on the truckle bed beside her child. He named the broadside. He named the 4 witnesses. He named his brother in the snow at Renfield, in the December of 1824, and the Ask Annabel he had heard from his brother's mouth before his brother had gone still in his arms. He named the 4 years of his silence. He named the engagement he had broken and the settlement he had signed, and the woman, Lady Sophronia Quincy, who had released him from it by her own hand on the morning of the 27th of August. He named his wife. He named her by her name on the register signed at 22 minutes past 6 that morning in Mr. Yelverton's side room. Charlotte Carberry Vane, Duchess of Renfield, broadside seller of Drury Lane. The gallery did not move. Annabel Tarrick's solicitor stood up. He said, "If it please the bench, the court will note that the chief witness in this matter, the so-called printer of the Drury Lane broadside, is a tradeswoman of no standing, whose statement cannot be tested by the customary objections of class and trade. We move that her testimony be excluded as inadmissible on those grounds, and that the matter be heard upon the deposition of his Grace alone." Sir Richard Burney looked at Lottie. Sir Richard Burney said, "Mrs. Carberry Vane, what say you to the objection?" Lottie stood up. She did not have notes. She had set the words of it at the press bench in the cold hour before dawn, while the kettle had boiled for May's clean face, and she had set them in her head the way she set type, in clean lines that did not need to be reset. She looked across the courtroom at Annabel Tarrick in the mourning dove silk. She said, "I sold a broadside for a penny apiece at the playhouse doors. It asked who saw a duke dragged into a St. Giles alley. His Grace breathes because 4 witnesses answered. You stand there because the same broadside named you." She sat down. Annabel Tarrick did not move. Annabel Tarrick's solicitor sat down. Sir Richard Burney looked at his clerk, and his clerk looked at Sir Richard Burney, and Sir Richard Burney said, "The witness's testimony is admitted. Miss Annabel Tarrick is held by order of this court on the charges of the wilful murder of Theodore Vane, the 3rd Duke of Renfield, on the 26th of December 1824. The attempted wilful murder of Maximilian Vane, the 4th Duke of Renfield, on the 17th of August 1828, and the corruption of 2 sworn servants of the Renfield household. The case is committed to the Old Bailey for the autumn sessions. Bench rises. The constable went up the gallery stair to take her. She did not resist. She looked across the courtroom at Maximilian Vane on the front bench. She looked at him for a long second. She did not look at Lottie. She had not looked at Lottie once in the hour of her own undoing, and she did not look at her now. Then the constable took her arm, and she went down the gallery stair into the back passage of the public office, and she did not appear in any room Lottie was in again. The bench rose, the courtroom emptied. Lottie sat on the front bench with May on her knee, and the Duke at her right hand, and let her shoulders down for the first time in 18 days. The Duke did not say anything. He had said everything he had to say at the box. He sat beside her with his hand flat on his own knee, and looked at the empty magistrate's bench, and the signet of his brother on his little finger caught the morning light through the high courtroom window. After a long while he said, "Lottie." She said, "Yes." He said, "We will go home." She nodded. He said, "Through the back. The crowd is at the front. I have asked the solicitor to bring up the carriage at the side yard." She nodded. He said, "We will go to Mayfair first, because the house is staffed and the household will need to meet you. We will come back to the print loft tonight if you wish it. The loft is yours. The press is yours. May's pallet is yours. I will sleep at Mayfair if it is easier for tonight. I will sleep on the press stool if it is easier for you. I am not asking it. I am saying it." She looked at him. She said, "We will go to Mayfair tonight. I will come back to the loft in the morning to take the press apart and have it carted, and I will let the shop to Daniel's brother Edward. I will not give up the press. The press will come to Mayfair and stand in the small room above the stable yard, and I will print at it on Saturdays. May will come with us. May's pallet will not come. May has a room of her own at Mayfair, and a pianoforte, and a music master who will be told that the lid stays open." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "And one other thing." He waited. She said, "You did not use the word love this morning. I do not need the word today. I will not ask it of you today. I have asked enough of you today. But I would like you to know that I will not ask it of you on any day after either, and that if it comes new, and from you. And if it does not come, then what we have, and the press stands above the stable yard, and the child has the pianoforte with the lid up, and after will not be a word I live inside any longer. From here." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "From here." He did not say the word love. He laid his hand on the press stool side of his knee, palm up, between them on the bench. He did not take her hand. He let his own lie there open, and after a moment she put hers into it, and his fingers closed around hers, and that was the whole of the thing in the empty courtroom that morning. May, on Lottie's lap, watched their 2 hands meet on the bench, and looked up at Lottie's face, and signed against Lottie's wrist, slow and content after one last time. Lottie nodded. She said, aloud for both of them to hear, "Not after. From here." 14 months passed. In the October of 1829, the south garden of Renfield House in Mayfair was full of the late roses that had not been pruned since the 3rd Duke's time, and Lottie Vane, Duchess of Renfield, was 6 months gone with the child that would be born in the January following. She wore a loose green muslin, and she had ink on the side of her hand from the press above the stable yard, where she had been setting a parish broadside on factory reform for her brother-in-law Edward Carberry at the Drury Lane shop. Edward was running the shop at twice the volume of the late Daniel, and was printing political work that had begun to be quoted in the House. The press imprint at the foot of the broadside read, in a single line of small italic above the date, D. and M. Carberry, EST, 1813, Daniel and Margaret. Lottie had set the line herself. May Carberry Vane, 8 years old, was at the pianoforte in the music room with the lid up. Her music master, who was a patient man from Hanover Square, who had been told the rule about the lid on his first morning, was reading the treble at her shoulder and tapping the baseline with a wooden spoon against the side of the case so that May's fingertips on the casewood could feel the rhythm of it. May was playing slow. May was playing well. The household had stopped working around May's half-deafness and started working with it. Lady Sophronia Quincy had been married in the April to Viscount Marbury, who had courted her in earnest for the better part of 3 years. She called on Lottie every other Friday. She had called the previous Friday. She and Lottie had drunk china tea in the morning room beside the late Theodore Vane's reading chair, above which the small portrait of Margaret Carberry now hung on a shelf the household had built for it the week Lottie had moved in. Nobody asked Lottie to take the portrait down. Lottie had not asked them not to. The shelf was just there now, and Margaret was on it, and on the wall opposite there was a small framed broadside, the one Lottie had set on the press at 6 in the morning of the 4th of September, with the 3 black lines reading. Mrs. Eliza Wick was housekeeper at large at Renfield. Her 7 grandchildren were at the parish school. Sammy Brent was in his 2nd year at the Duke's solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn and was being read law in the evenings. Hollis Crail was in a clean bed at the home farm in Berkshire, dying slowly of the gin but with a roof over his head and a fire in his grate. Walter Pry had had a stroke at the Old Bailey door on the morning of the verdict and was buried at the Renfield village churchyard with a stone the Duke had paid for and a name on it. Miss Annabel Tarrick had been tried in the autumn sessions, convicted on all 3 counts, sentenced to death, commuted to transportation for life on the grounds of her sex, and had sailed from Deptford in the March on the convict ship Diadem bound for New South Wales. She had not written to England. Her father, Sir Mortimer Tarrick, was bankrupt and reduced to a single Sussex cottage on the charity of his sister. Daniel Carberry's grave at St Clement Danes had a new headstone laid on the spring anniversary. Lottie had had it cut at her own cost. The stone read, in plain rounded capitals, "Husband to Margaret and to Charlotte, 1880 to 1827. Daniel had not been forgotten. Margaret had not been moved off the wall. The press at the stable yard ran on Saturdays. The pianoforte was open. The autumn afternoon was clear and gold. Lottie stood at the garden gate and watched the Duke walk along the gravel path from the Vane family chapel at the bottom of the south lawn. He had been to the chapel alone. He went on most Sundays, but the gravel walk on a Sunday in October was a particular walk, and Lottie had stayed at the gate with the late roses at her shoulder and a hand on the curve of her belly and had watched him go. He had had a folded sheet of paper in his hand on the way down. He did not have it now. She knew what the sheet was. He had taken it from the frame on the morning room wall the night before and folded it along its old creases. It was the broadside she had set on the press at dawn on the 4th of September 1828. It was the 2nd broadside, the one with the 3 black lines. He had taken it down to the chapel, and he had laid it on Theodore Vane's grave, and he had weighted it with a single stone. He came back along the gravel path toward her, with the sun on his hair and the late roses moving slightly in the small autumn wind. He did not hurry. He had not been a man who hurried since the morning he had walked out of the Bow Street public office. She had been a woman who hurried all her life until that morning. They had grown into the same pace since. He came up to the gate. She said, "You laid it on him." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you say his name?" He said, "I said his name. I said it out loud. I asked his pardon for the 4 years. I told him about the child." She nodded. He said, "And the broadside is on him with the stone." She said, "Good." He looked at her belly. He had been looking at it a great deal in the last fortnight. He laid his hand on the green muslin over it, and the child inside it moved against his palm, the small, slow turn of an unborn elbow against the inside of a mother's skin, and his face did the thing his face had been doing for the last fortnight, which was to soften by half a degree, in a way Lottie had not seen on it in any other room. He said, "If it is a son, we will not name him for Theodore." She said, "No." He said, "Theodore was Theodore. The child will be the child. The child is not after Theodore." She said, "No, the child is not after anybody." He said, "Not after." She said, "From here." He nodded. He said, "From here." He kept his hand on the curve of her belly for a long moment, with the late roses moving at her shoulder, and then he took it away, and he opened the garden gate, and he held it open for her. She went through into the south garden with him. Inside the music room, May Carberry-Vane was playing the slow movement of a sonata. The music master tapped the bass line on the casewood with a wooden spoon. In the morning room, the small portrait of Margaret Carberry stood on its shelf above the late Theodore Vane's reading chair. At the bottom of the south lawn, the folded broadside lay on Theodore Vane's grave with a single stone on it, and the small wind moved the corner of it once and let it lie. The chapel bell at St. George's, Hanover Square, struck the half-hour. In the loft above the press in Drury Lane that was no longer her loft, but was Edward Carberry's, the Stanhope stood quiet, the typecases at the back wall full and orderly, and a thin red dusk laid itself along the courtyard window where May Carberry had once kept watch. In the south garden of Renfield House, Lottie Vane closed the gate behind her and walked with her husband up the gravel path toward the music room, where the lid of the pianoforte was open and the child at the keyboard was playing the slow movement well, and the household was hers, and the press at the stable yard would run on the Saturday, and the word after had passed out of her solitary keeping for good. Not after. From here.